We welcome to the show from Victoria University of Wellington, Professor of Taxation, Lisa Marriot. Lisa, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's a very exciting time leading up to this election. I think 88 or 87 days to go, and everyone's all thinking about what's happening and what's coming up, and people are releasing policies, and academics are talking about fairer and better elections. And you've just done an article with Max Rashbrooke, headed "Tougher Donation Limits and Funding Fixes Would Make Future New Zealand Elections Fairer for All." There are some things in the article I really like to speak to, but to start off with, maybe as we always kind of do, I'll kind of just throw the ball to you and give you the floor, because we hear about money in politics, and I think most of us think about a broken American system, and we think about, freer and fairer is what we do in New Zealand, but your article doesn't quite sell it that way. Do you want to maybe break down some of the basics before we get into the actual details of the article as to why you've written this and what's it all about?
Yeah, sure. And actually, to your point, I think most of us agree we don't want a system like they've got in America, where you just 100%. Have enormous amounts of money thrown at politics. So Max and I spent actually pretty much most of last year working on a big report about political party funding. And one of the things that we did, look, we collected a lot of data from a number of different sources, but one of the things we did is we approached all the large donors over a specific period of time, so about 100 or so donors, and we asked if they would be happy to talk to us about why they donate. And to be honest with you, we actually did it because we assumed that nobody would want to talk to us, but actually quite a few people did. So we had some really good conversations with people who donate to political parties. Now, bear in mind, these, in order for us to know who's donating, these have to be the large donors. So they're the people who are donating over $30,000. So, these are the people who are donating the big money, really.
The Graham Harts of the world, the billionaires and the hundreds of millionaires of this world.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Because actually, you do have to be reasonably wealthy to be contributing those sorts of sums of money. So we had a talk to a number of different types of people across the political spectrum, and we asked them why they donate and what they get out of it. Now, nobody of course said to us, we donate because we think we can influence policy. No, nobody's saying that, but certainly quite a number of people said to us they donate because it gives them access, so greater access to people than they would potentially have otherwise. Now, access, of course, is not the same as influence. We're not saying it is, but there is a problem when wealthier people get greater access to the people who are making the decisions than the likes of other people who aren't making big donations and don't have similar sorts of access. Now, I know some politicians will say to you that they will give time to anybody, and I'm sure that is right for some of them. However, what we were made pretty aware of is that for people making larger donations, they expect a larger amount of contact with the people in power.
I'm sure there will be some highly ranked politicians whose number is in the phone numbers of some of these wealthy individuals. There's probably not so many solo mums with those same phone numbers.
That's exactly the point. Yeah. And so then you start asking the question of, okay, you've got the access, even if you're making just small talk conversations, you're in the inner circle, you are much closer to influence than most of us.
I'd like to actually bring up some examples, because the article that you've written, which we'll get to as we're talking through, does specifically speak to some examples of what you were told. Obviously, you haven't identified who they were, but when you were talking to some of these wealthy donors, some of them said things like this. One of them noted that a real problem with people who accumulate a lot of money supporting the systems that have allowed them to accumulate a lot of money. There's another person that said that they did not think that it's right that rich people can distort democracy, although one of the ironies there, of course, is that not saying actively doing it, but potentially on some level that's actually what's happening if they've got access. And finally, not everyone was concerned about the situation, with one donor telling you guys, quote, "The fact that some can promote their position more than others doesn't worry me." So in other words, the fact that we with money can get onto the 9th floor, maybe not literally, but metaphorically speaking, no big deal. No big deal. That's a interesting, entitled opinion to have, I guess.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it is that sort of, it's that sort of view that worries us. And the other thing is, of course, the majority of these large donations go to National and ACT. So they're going to the right. And whilst, you can make an argument that, of course, people are free, of course they are, to donate wherever they want. What we're not seeing is, we're not seeing a more sort of balanced funding allocation to political parties in order that they can campaign on a more even playing field. Because we actually, in an ideal democratic system, we do want all parties to be able to effectively communicate their policies to the population, so the population's well informed and can make well-informed decisions about where their vote is going to go.
So you've said that the big donations go a lot to ACT and National, to the right. Yeah. When you're looking at things like what Martin Gillen said, which is that, I'm paraphrasing now, that the preferences of the poor or middle class citizens aren't being represented as well, or aren't being chased as well, or advocated as well by these politicians. What they're advocating for seems to rest with the wealthy donors and what they want, or the sort of positions they would take. So what I'm wondering is, if the majority of the donations go to the right, to quote a word, is this an issue that goes across the political spectrum? So, for example, in Labour, do you still find that the preferences of the poor or middle class citizens aren't being pushed or advocated as much by Labour, as opposed to what the wealthy donors may want unofficially as well? Or is this an issue for the right?
Well, it's a particularly topical question, isn't it, given the statement that was made by Labour about capital gains taxes and wealth taxes last week.
100%, yeah.
Yeah. We look, in fairness to Labour, they have done some things that, do, minimum wage increases and so on. And I'm not saying that there is no policy that it is not directed for those who have the least in society. But certainly last week's announcement appears to be directly targeting the most wealthy. If we look at who holds the wealth in New Zealand, it's the very, very top proportion of people. So yes, do I think the Labour Party have, are also trying to attract donations from traditional, perhaps right-leaning parties? Maybe. We don't actually have a lot of donors in New Zealand who contribute across the political spectrum. Most tend to be, either within that sort of ACT or National grouping, or the Labour Green grouping, and then there's some other sort of others who float around with New Zealand First and so on. So we don't tend to see a lot of people, hedging their bets, if you like.
Let's have a look also at what the research is saying, or the report is saying recently. A final report delivered to the government in November. Too late to have impact on this 2023 election, but there's been a report done, an interim report from the Independent Electoral Review as to how to make things fairer. Your article obviously touches on this as well. A few things that is suggested in the report: replacing the current broadcasting allocation with a fairer and more effective form of state funding for registered parties, per vote and base funding for registered political parties, tax credits for donations up to $1,000, introducing an expanded electoral access fund, and a new fund to facilitate engaging with Māori communities. I guess I was thinking as well about what's changed ahead of this election. This one here I was thinking about. Changes included lowering the reporting threshold for large donations from $30,000 to $20,000, and new requirements around reporting donations above $1,500. Is this something that wealthy donors are trying to hide as well? Because there is a register of wealthy donors. I've seen it. And if you had to, is it a problem in New Zealand that people are going to, $29,999 so their names don't get made public? Is it going to make that big of a deal? Like I was going to say, Graham Hart gave hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to both National and ACT. We know that it's in the register. Are there going to be a group of people who are going to go, well, now that it's $20,000, I'm going to give $19,900, not $29,900? Is it going to make a difference, that particular idea, do you think?
Yeah, potentially, because for some of those donors, it's only a timing difference. So while that, you're right, the threshold for sort of, we'll call it immediate or reasonably quick disclosure, public disclosure of those donors has reduced from 30,000 to 20,000 for this year. And we should get those details within 10 days of those donations being made. But what will then also happen is with some of those changes that came in from the 1st of January this year, in their annual return, parties also have to report the details of names and addresses of donors where it's over $5,000. But we won't know that until their return, which will probably be April next year.
Right.
So at some point it will be visible, but it just won't be visible in the short term. You know, one of the things we were told when we were talking to people is that people do like to be sort of invisible with their donation. Some of them, you know, obviously if you're having a big donation, there's no chance that that's going to happen. But for some people, there was a bit of a concern that, you know, perhaps you donate to one party and another party is forming government, you know, whether that might perhaps have some implication to your business or whatever it is that you want to influence. If you have, you know, essentially paid money to the wrong side. So there was a bit of a view of that. But now with that threshold being quite low for eventual disclosure of $5,000, actually, it will be interesting to see what happens to that sort of block of money and whether that has reduced quite a bit. Because previously we used to see that, again, that chunk of money, but at a higher threshold. So next year will be where the sort of the more interesting information comes out.
We hear the catch cry in America, get money out of politics.
Yeah.
And we hear them saying, looking to places like, I mean, I don't know if literally they look to New Zealand, but like New Zealand and Australia and the UK as to places, as I said earlier, where there's freer and fairer elections as it's seen in America. But the way you're describing it and the way that it's written, it doesn't sound like we've gotten money out of politics. And one last thing from the article, studies from overseas indicate those who raise the most money tend to win. And based on the recent donation research, donors know that too. Wealthy New Zealanders admitted to gaining access to the levers of power through political donations. Those that raise the most money tend to win. So therefore, money in politics is happening in New Zealand, maybe not to the same extent as we hear it in America, but is there a way to do it to actually get money out of politics? Or is it like everybody's right to be able to contribute financially to the political party? Where is that line between making it as free and fair as possible and also, you know, I'm a fan of this golf club, I want to give money to this golf club. I'm a fan of this political party, I want to give money to this political party. How do we marry up those two things?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and absolutely can be done. Canada have done this really well, but there are different ways of doing it. It does involve a bit of state funding, but not a huge amount, it has to be said. So what Canada have done, if we start there, they have a really generous system of tax credits. And how a tax credit works is basically, you know, if I donate $100 to my preferred political party, in Canada, that $100 would attract a 75% tax credit. So I would get $75 back. The party would get $100, and it costs me $25. So there's a very big sort of state contribution. Now, it abates. So the more I donate, the less tax credit I get. And at around about sort of $1,600, that's when I'm no longer getting any sort of tax credit for that. So, and if I had donated, say, $1,600, I'd be getting around about half of that back. Now, that's one way to really encourage people to think about donating to political parties, because a lot of people might want to donate, but could only donate a little bit. And, you know, if it was going to cost you $25, but you knew your party was going to get $100, then, you know, maybe that might be something people would do. Yeah. So there is that. There is other type of state funding, like per vote funding, and that normally has like maybe a lump sum payment from the government alongside it, because you know, sometimes newer parties or smaller parties don't have enough votes to make that meaningful. But lots of countries do that approach as well. If you were to do the tax credit approach, and actually, to be honest with you, even if you did nothing, Max and I both agreed that capping the maximum amount that somebody can donate in any given year is a really good start. So even, you know, if you kept it at $15,000 a year, so the maximum any person can donate is $15,000, you know, that's still a reasonable sum of money. It's not probably enough to suggest that you might get any particular benefit from that, but it sort of has the potential to keep the real big money out of politics, which, you know, certainly Max and I agreed would be a good step.
Right. So really the only way to do that is to make it like these people can give this much to this level, no more during the year. You can't give it 10 donations of that amount. But then if you can only give a maximum of $15,000, then $100,000 can't be given. Interested to think about, like, we hear about bequeaths and that sort of thing, like when people have passed away and they leave a third of their estate to the Greens or something, there might have to be something written in it that would have still allowed that to happen, because who knows when that's going to happen. But either way, the way to get big money out of politics is to basically make it so you can't give big money. That's sort of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like bequeaths, look, you could probably structure that so maybe it could be deleted over time. So 50,000 a year for, you know, 5 or 10 years, whatever it is. Max and I did do some numbers on the tax credit approach in New Zealand, basically taking the Canada model and sort of applying it here. And we calculated that for a cost, it will be a cost to the government, but a cost to the government of $2.35 per voter, you could have the same amount of funding, actually more funding, for the political parties than what they get from donations. Well, we calculated this based on donations as it's sort of 2020, 2021. There was big money coming in last year, so probably wouldn't quite cover that. But $2.35 per voter, you could get rid of the large donors from the New Zealand political system, have a system of tax credits, and really get rid of all the potential issues with influence of, you know, a small number of people in that political environment.
So just for my clarity, if it was $2.35 per voter, does that mean per voter from the last election? So Labor had 1 million votes, National had 800,000 votes, so Labor gets 1 million times 235, National gets...
Oh, sorry.
So is that what you're saying?
No, I have not explained that very well. So no, what we did is we costed out like a tax credit system and how that might look in New Zealand. So we took basically sort of the amount of external funds that all the various political parties had raised around about the time of the last election, and then we looked. We sort of modelled based on what happens in Canada, the proportion of people that vote, the amount of donations that those people vote, and what a system of tax credits would cost based on all those factors. So it wasn't actually applying that money to political parties as such, but we did, when we did the calculations, we calculated it to make sure that no political party would be worse off than what they currently are. And this is when we sort of crunched all those numbers, and it came out at $2.35. So the reason why we did this is just to show that it's not a particularly expensive exercise to put a bit of state funding into the sort of the political party finance, and then take out the private donations.
How would that state funding then get applied to the parties, or would it just be used, in other words, for a radio advertising, television? You give it to him almost like as a credit, like because I think obviously you couldn't do it equally, because, you know, a smaller party is not going to get the same as what the National Party would, and if you're going to base it on funding, that still means the bulk of it would go to the right, because that's where the bulk of the private funding goes right now. How would it get applied?
Yeah, so you're right. So the way the tax credit model works is, again, you're capping the maximum donation. So if you don't have a relatively small number of people making huge donations, you do lose that big money coming in. But what it also does is it facilitates a lot more of the smaller donations, and we did find quite. It does seem to work really well in Canada. They've had the system for quite some time, and the parties do get quite a good, there's quite a strong relationship between the number of votes that they get and the amount of funding that they get. So it does seem to actually manage itself. And I think a lot of that is because it does facilitate a lot of small donations, whereas here what we have is a small number of really large donations.
Gotcha. From the University of Victoria in Wellington, that is Professor Lisa Marriot, Professor of Taxation. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate you giving us some thoughts. And if people want to check out more about this, go to The Conversation for your article.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Pat.